Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia, by Michael Parenti. Narrated by Rich Miller. Introduction. Whom do we believe? This book deals with the lies our leaders have been telling us for more than a decade about events in the former Yugoslavia and how these events fit into the broader context of U.S. global policy. In the chapters ahead, I investigate the conflicts leading to the dismemberment of that country and the interests motivating U.S. leaders and their NATO allies. I am not one of those critics who think that Western policy vis-à-vis Yugoslavia has been misdirected or confused. Top policymakers are intelligent, resourceful, and generally more aware of what they are doing than those who see them as foolish and bungling. U.S. policy is not filled with contradictions and inconsistencies. It has performed brilliantly and steadily in the service of those who own most of the world and who want to own all of it. That some critics may not know what policymakers are doing does not mean the policymakers themselves do not know what they are doing. That Western leaders make misleading statements about their goals and intentions does not denote confusion on their part, but a desire to confuse their publics as to what interests they are really serving. That they are misleading others does not mean that they are themselves misled, although of course there are times when they make mistakes and suffer bafflement in regard to tactics and timing. But seldom are they confused about their opposition to socialism and their dedication to free market globalization and what they euphemistically call democratic reforms. In the last decade or so, they have become more open about the powerful economic interests behind their pursuit of democracy. And whenever democracy actually begins to work too well, whenever it begins to thwart or limit the neoliberal free market agenda rather than act as its legitimating cloak, their dedication readily shifts from free market democracy to free market autocracy. I will argue that Western intervention in Yugoslavia has not been benign but ruthlessly selfish, not confused but well-directed, given the interests that the interventionists serve. The motive behind the intervention was not NATO's newfound humanitarianism, but a desire to put Yugoslavia, along with every other country, under the suzerainty of free market globalization. I am not the only one who sees the conflict this way. The decision-makers themselves do, too. As I will reveal, they have been far more concerned about privatization and neoliberal reforms, rollbacks, than about the well-being of the various Yugoslav peoples. Western leaders talk of peace and perpetrate merciless wars. They call for democracy while supporting ex-Nazis and fostering despotic intercessions. They hail self-determination while exercising coercive colonial rule over other peoples. They denounce ethnic cleansing while practicing it themselves. This is what I shall attempt to demonstrate in the chapters ahead. Much of the debate about the Yugoslav conflict revolves around questions like, whom do we believe? What sources do we rely on? Is it the free and independent Western media or Belgrade's government-controlled press? I would answer as follows. The U.S. media, as with most of the news media in other Western nations, are not free and independent. They are owned and controlled by largely conservative corporate cartels that adhere to the self-serving neoliberal ideology of international finance capital. The goal of these politico-economic elites is to transform the world into a global economy under the tutelage of the transnational corporations, backed by the unanswerable imperial might of the United States and its allies. A key component of that global strategy, of course, entails capitalist restoration within the former communist countries. The corporate-owned media seldom stray too far from that dominant ideological paradigm, not only in the news that is reported, but also in its editorials, commentaries, and opinion pieces. To the extent that journalists raise critical questions about policy, it is almost always at the operational level. Are the bombings proving effective? Is the refugee problem under control? Never do they question the underlying presumptions that brought about the bombings or created the refugees. The publicly owned media, such as PBS and NPR in the United States or the BBC in Britain, are not much better. They cannot be considered free and independent either. They function in an enduring political culture, subject to pressures from those who fund them, including, in the case of PBS and NPR, the federal government and large corporations. And they are no more immune to the hegemonic ideology than other mainstream institutions. Indeed, the public media have shown themselves to be eager cheerleaders for the official line on Yugoslavia. So corporate-dominated media rather faithfully reflect the line put out by corporate-dominated political leaders, those decision-makers who build their careers in service to the economic powers that be. In regard to Yugoslavia, the Western press dropped all pretense at critical independence and, with some notable exceptions, went into overdrive to demonize the Serbs and create the sensationalist justification for NATO's destabilizing and violent interventions. If Western sources are not reliable, can we rely on Yugoslav sources? While no doubt intent upon giving only their side of the story, Belgrade's official releases might contain useful and reliable information. Thus, if Belgrade reported that the mass graves, which supposedly littered Kosovo, were nowhere to be found once the NATO forces occupied that province, or that Albanian separatists destroyed 80 Serbian Orthodox churches, monasteries, and other religious edifices in Kosovo since the NATO occupation, there is no reason to assume ipso facto that these stories are fabrications. In fact, both reports proved true, and were even given some passing attention in the Western press, though with a rather different spin. Furthermore, Belgrade's side of the story is one we never get in the West, where supposedly we get all sides of the story. For that reason alone, Belgrade sources might deserve some attention. In any case, I want to point out that almost all the information used in this book emanates from well-established Western sources: the European Union, the European Commission, executive arm of the EU, the European Community's Committee on Women's Rights, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and its Kosovo Verification Mission, the UN War Crimes Commission and various other UN commissions and reports, the British Helsinki Human Rights Group, the International Criminal Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, ICTY, various State Department reports, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency and Western European Drug Enforcement Units, the German Foreign Office and German Defense Ministry reports, the International Crisis Group, Amnesty International, and the International Red Cross. In addition, I rely on members of the U.S. Congress, including a former U.S. Senate Majority Leader, along with a former U.S. State Department official under the Bush administration, a former Deputy Commander of the U.S. European Command, and several UN and NATO generals and international negotiators. I also note the critical and neglected comments of Spanish Air Force pilots, forensic teams, and UN monitors. For general information, I draw not only upon progressive sources like Covert Action Quarterly and the International Action Center, but also the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Le Monde Diplomatique, London Times, Toronto Star, Foreign Affairs, Christian Century, Economist, U.S. News and World Report, and various other U.S., British, Canadian, and French mainstream publications. This raises another question. If we judge the mainstream press and Western official sources to be neither free nor independent, and certainly not objective, why should we believe any of what they say? And what would be the criterion whereby we reject or select what is presented? The answer is the same as the one I gave in regard to Yugoslav sources. That a source is neither independent nor objective does not mean it cannot contain revealing information, often buried in relatively obscure places. Generally, mainstream information that goes against the mainstream's own dominant paradigm is likely to be reliable. It certainly cannot be dismissed as self-serving. Thus, if the New York Times, or the EU, or the CIA, or whatever publication, organization, or agency prints a particular item or account of events that contradicts what it usually maintains, then that would seem to be of special note. After all, they said it themselves. If the CIA were to admit, after years of denial, that it had a hand in the Central American drug trade, as some of its operatives have indeed testified under oath, then we can believe the CIA in that instance. If the Serbs were to admit that atrocities were committed by their paramilitaries, as indeed they have admitted, then a hostile audience could accept this as a reliable datum even though it came from Serbian sources, or especially since it came from Serbian sources. Furthermore, there happens to be a public record that reveals a great deal of information normally ignored by Western propagandists. Thus, my argument against the hypocrisies of the Rambouillet Agreement is not drawn from Belgrade sources, but from my reading of the Rambouillet Agreement itself. And my argument that Western leaders are intent upon foisting the inequities and hardships of the free market upon Yugoslavia and other nations is supported by what Western leaders repeatedly and explicitly have said and done on behalf of free market rollbacks in Yugoslavia and elsewhere. I do not have to go to Belgrade sources to support that point. Finally, even when they are lying, the powers that be often reveal more than they intend. They sometimes can be hoisted on their own petards, given the disparities between their words and actions, given the contradictions and improbabilities of certain of their postures. There are some people who grow indignant at the suggestion that their political leaders lie to them, especially in regard to foreign policy. To suggest as much is to indulge in conspiracy theories, they maintain. In fact, U.S. presidents never lie so much as when they talk about U.S. foreign policy. In the public stances he took in regard to Yugoslavia, Bill Clinton proved himself a professional liar. When dealing with what he and his associates have said, we can, without turning to alternative sources, point to the lack of evidence to support their claims, and to the contrary evidence suggested by their actions. And we can note their persistent manipulation of images and labels by which they have tried to short-circuit our critical thinking and make evidence itself irrelevant. As is frequently the case, liars can be the best witnesses against themselves. So I invite the listener to consider an alternative approach, one that is in short supply in the Western corporate communication universe. I believe the public has not been told the whole story, the true story about the relentless attack on Yugoslavia. To arrive at a closer approximation of the truth is the first duty of a democratic citizenry. Only then can people exercise some control over their leaders rather than being led around by them. We owe this much to ourselves and to the people of the various nations still targeted by the Western militarists and free marketeers. 1. Hypocritical humanitarianism. From March 24th to June 10th, 1999, U.S. military forces, in coordination with a number of other NATO powers, launched round-the-clock aerial attacks against Yugoslavia, dropping 20,000 tons of bombs and killing upwards of 3,000 women, children, and men. All this was done out of humanitarian concern for Albanians in Kosovo, or so we were asked to believe. In the span of a few months, President Clinton bombed 4 countries: Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, repeatedly, and Yugoslavia, massively. At the same time, the U.S. national security state was involved in proxy wars in Angola, Mexico, Chiapas, Colombia, and East Timor, among other places. U.S. forces were deployed across the globe at some 300 major overseas bases, all in the name of peace, democracy, national security, and humanitarianism. Some of us cannot help noticing that U.S. leaders have been markedly selective in their supposedly humanitarian interventions. They made no moves against the Czech Republic for its mistreatment of the Roma, Gypsies, or Britain for its long-time repression of the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland, or the Hutu for the mass murder of 500,000 Tutsi in Rwanda, or the French who were complicit in that massacre. Nor did U.S. leaders consider launching humanitarian bombings against the Guatemalan people for the Guatemalan military's systematic slaughter of tens of thousands of Mayan villagers, or against the Indonesian people because their generals killed over 200,000 East Timorese and were engaged in such slaughter through the summer of 1999, not to mention the estimated 500,000 to 1 million Indonesians these same generals exterminated in 1965 and after. Nor have humanitarian concerns caused U.S. leaders and right-wing paramilitary forces to move against the scores of other countries around the world engaging in subversion, sabotage, terrorism, torture, drug trafficking, death squads, mass murder, and wars of attrition, actions that have been far worse than anything Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic has been charged with. In most cases, the U.S. national security state has not only tolerated such atrocities, but has been actively complicit with the perpetrators, who usually happen to be recipients of U.S. aid and trade. Consider how the Kurds have been treated. At 25 million, the Kurds are the largest nationality group in the world without their own state. For thousands of years, they have inhabited an area now part of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and the former Soviet Union. For decades, U.S. leaders and their faithful media mouthpieces ignored the suffering of the Kurdish people. During a brief period in 1990, while busily discrediting and attacking Iraq, U.S. policymakers and media pundits made much of the fact that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein was mistreating the Kurds under his rule. But not a critical word has been uttered against Turkey, that most faithful and repressive U.S. client state, with its long history of torturing and killing dissidents. In recent times, Turkish leaders have razed or forcibly evacuated 3,000 Kurdish villages. 40,000 Kurds have died in the process, with 2 million rendered homeless. Here was an ethnic repression that dwarfed anything the Serbs were accused of perpetrating. Yet U.S. leaders made no move to bomb Turkey. On the contrary, they have sold or given Ankara $15 billion worth of weapons since 1980. As a NATO member, Turkey was one of the countries that assisted in the bombing of Yugoslavia. In 1995, the Clinton administration grudgingly acknowledged that Turkish leaders were committing serious abuses. But not to worry. Turkey's human rights record was reportedly improving. In any case, as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights John Shattuck pointed out, I don't think the United States is responsible for Turkey's internal policies. Why, then, does the United States presume to be so urgently responsible for Yugoslavia's internal policies, to the point of leveling death and destruction upon its people? In 1993, Western leaders and liberal media commentators in the United States and Britain were calling for an interventionist campaign to rescue the Bosnian Muslims from the reputedly wicked Serbs. At that very time, more than 1,000 people were dying every day in the CIA-sponsored war of attrition against Angola, far many times more than were perishing in Bosnia. The civil war in Liberia had displaced 85% of the population. In Afghanistan, in Kabul alone, about 1,000 people were killed in 1 week in May 1993. In July 1993, the Israelis launched a saturation shelling of southern Lebanon, turning some 300,000 Muslims into refugees in what had every appearance of being a policy of depopulation or ethnic cleansing. Why were Western policymakers and media commentators so concerned about the Muslims of Bosnia, but so unconcerned about the Muslims of Lebanon or Iraq? Why were they so stirred by the partition of Bosnia, but not the partition of Lebanon? As the journalist and filmmaker Joan Phillips asks, why the Muslims of Bosnia and never the Serbs of Bosnia? Why have liberals identified with the Muslim side in Bosnia so strongly that they have disqualified the Serbs from any sympathy? The Serbs have certainly got blood on their hands. But have all the atrocities in the dirty war in what was Yugoslavia been committed by one side? Why are 800,000 Serbian refugees invisible to those liberal commentators searching for victims? Is it because the Serbs really are demons? Or is it because an increasingly conformist and uncritical media jumped on the anti-Serb bandwagon created by their governments at the start of the war in Yugoslavia, and never asked serious questions about what was going on? Bosnia must remain multi-ethnic, Western leaders argued, even as they tirelessly contrived to break up the large multi-ethnic Federation of Yugoslavia, itself a nation of 28 nationalities, and form fear-ridden mono-ethnic statelets. All in all, there seems to be little consistency and even less principle involved in the liberal crusade for Bosnia. It makes you think that there might be a hidden agenda here somewhere, Phillips concludes. So the question remains, Is the U.S.-NATO forceful intervention in Yugoslavia really motivated by a concern for the various non-Serbian ethnic groups? Is it to keep the peace and stop a genocide? For more than a decade, the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia have been presented as the culmination of historically rooted ethnic and religious enmities. The fact is, there was no civil war, no widespread killings, and no ethnic cleansing until the Western powers began to inject themselves into Yugoslavia's internal affairs, financing the secessionist organizations and creating the politico-economic crisis that ignited the political strife. Are the Serbs really the new Nazis of Europe? For those who need to be reminded, the Nazis waged aggressive war on a dozen or more nations in Europe, systematically exterminating some 9 million defenseless civilians, including 6 million Jews, and causing the deaths of millions of others during their invasions, including 22 million Soviet citizens. The charges of mass atrocity and genocide leveled against Belgrade will be treated in the chapters ahead. It is said that lies have wings, while truth feebly slogs behind, destined never to catch up. This is often treated as being the inherent nature of communication, and it may sometimes be the case that truthful but mundane information cannot compete with the broad images repeatedly splashed across the media universe. But this is not sufficient explanation for the way issues are propagated in the global arena. Rather than ascribing reified, self-determining powers to concepts like truth and falsehood, we should note that the lies our leaders tell us succeed so well because they are given repeated and ubiquitous dissemination. The truth seldom catches up because those who rule nations and manage the mass communication universe have no interest in giving it equal currency. If millions believe the lies again and again, it is because that is all they hear. After a while, it becomes the only thing they want to hear. Truly remarkable are the people throughout the world who remonstrate and demonstrate against these humanitarian interventions. The broad public in the United States and other Western countries remained notably lukewarm about the air campaign against Yugoslavia. The Clinton administration seemed acutely aware of this, as manifested by its unwillingness to commit ground troops out of fear that the U.S. public would not tolerate the loss of American lives. A war for which citizens are not willing to make any sacrifices whatsoever is not a war for which the government can claim deep public support. Of course, Americans did not like what they heard about genocide and ethnic cleansing, but there were no signs of the jingoistic fervor that gripped many people during the Gulf War a decade earlier. If anything, there was a general feeling that they were not being told the whole story. The obviously one-sided character of the air war, the fact that Yugoslavia had not invaded anyone, and the impact of the bombing upon a European civilian population contributed to a general sense of unease. Indeed, in the 11 weeks of NATO's mission, support dropped from over 65% to barely 50% and promised to continue downward. In response, the Clinton administration, with the active complicity of the media, took every opportunity to downplay the death and destruction caused by the bombings, and every opportunity to hype images of satanic Serbian atrocities. Still, the wavering support for the onslaught must have played a part in the White House's decision to stop the bombing and settle for something less than the total occupation of Yugoslavia. This should remind us that the struggle against war and aggression begins at home. Thus, it is imperative for us to make every effort to look critically at the prevailing orthodoxy and devote ourselves to a different course. When terrorism is not terrorism. State Department Counterterrorism Coordinator Michael Sheehan, speaking at a briefing on the 1999 annual Patterns of Global Terrorism report, May 1, 2000. Sheehan: Our definition of terrorism by the legislation is very explicit. But in general terms, in a war, if military forces are attacking each other, it's not terrorism. But if an armed terrorist organization attacks civilian targets, that's terrorism. So that's generally the breakdown. Or if you attack, it's also a terrorist attack if you attack military people in barracks, such as the Kobar bombings or the Marine barracks in 1982. Those are terrorist acts. Each case is taken on a case-by-case basis. Reporter. So, for example, if the United States were to drop, what do you call them? Cruise missiles on people who were in barracks or in tents, as it may be, would that be terrorism? Could that be terrorism? Sheehan. No. Laughter. The laughter was not included in the transcript of the briefing released by the State Department, but could be heard when this segment was played on C-SPAN radio. 2. Third Worldization. Unlike most nations, Yugoslavia was built on an idea, Ramsey Clark once noted. With a federation of their own, it was hoped that the southern Slavs would not remain weak and divided peoples, easy prey to imperial interests. The idea was that they would learn to live together, forming a substantial territory capable of economic development. Indeed, after World War II, socialist Yugoslavia became something of an economic success. Between 1960 and 1980, it had one of the most vigorous growth rates, along with free medical care and education, a guaranteed right to an income, 1 month vacation with pay, a literacy rate of over 90%, and a life expectancy of 72 years. Yugoslavia also offered its multi-ethnic citizenry affordable public transportation, housing, and utilities, in a mostly publicly owned market socialist economy. As late as 1990, better than 60% of the total labor force was in the public sector, much of it self-managed. Even Misha Glenny, who sees Stalinism lurking in every communist system, was able to state, "Throughout 40 years of communist control in Central and Southeastern Europe, Belgrade had always offered a ray of optimism. Together with its sister cities in the Yugoslav Federation, Zagreb, Ljubljana, and Sarajevo, it boasted a lively cultural life and a relatively high standard of living." This was not the kind of country that global capitalism would normally countenance. Still, the United States tolerated socialistic Yugoslavia's existence for 45 years because it was seen as a wedge to divide the Warsaw Pact nations. The continued existence of Yugoslavia as a non-aligned socialist country also had the grudging support of the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia was a founding member of the United Nations and of the Non-Aligned Nations Conference, and a regular participant in UN peacekeeping missions. But by 2000 it had been reduced to a pariah, the only country ever expelled from the United Nations. After the overthrow of communism throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, FRY, remained the only nation in that region that would not voluntarily discard what remained of its socialism and install an unalloyed free market system. It also proudly had no interest in joining NATO. The U.S. goal has been to transform the FRY into a third world region, a cluster of weak right-wing principalities with the following characteristics: incapable of charting an independent course of self-development, natural resources completely accessible to transnational corporate exploitation, including the enormous mineral wealth in Kosovo, an impoverished but literate and skilled population working at subsistence wages, a cheap labor pool that will help depress wages in Western Europe and elsewhere, dismantled petroleum, engineering, mining, fertilizer, pharmaceutical, construction, automotive, and agricultural industries, so they no longer offer competition against Western producers. U.S. policymakers wanted to abolish Yugoslavia's public sector services and social programs, using the same shock therapy imposed on the former communist countries of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The ultimate goal has been the complete privatization and third worldization of Yugoslavia, Eastern Europe, and, for that matter, every other nation. It is to replace the social wage with a neoliberal global free market, a process that would deliver still greater wealth and power into the hands of those at the top. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, FRY leaders, not unlike communist leaders in other Eastern European countries, committed a disastrous error. They decided to borrow heavily from the West in order to simultaneously expand the country's industrial base, its export production, and its output of domestic consumer goods. But when Western economies entered a recession and blocked Yugoslav exports, thereby diminishing its export earnings, this created a huge debt for Belgrade. and the massive debt began to develop its own interest-fed momentum. In short order, as in so many other...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?